Welcome back to the channel, and thanks for jumping in to join us for episode 4 of our Problematic Bible Verses series. In this episode, we're going to be covering a verse that if you've been following the channel for any length of time, you know that we've covered pretty extensively in the past. It's Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21. I've referenced it a few different times in a few different videos, but I don't ever want to assume that anybody watching this video has gone through and watched all our previous videos. And so for that reason, it is a verse that does pop up on almost every single list of problematic Bible verses that we find. So I feel like it's worth slowing down a little bit, giving it its own space, talking about it once again, and really kind of working through it very carefully. Before we do get into it, I want to say that I apologize for the delay in getting this video out. My intention was to get it out Saturday, but life seemed to have other plans. We had a few things come up that took my attention away, and it did delay getting this video out a little bit. So for that, I apologize. And I definitely appreciate your patience in waiting for it to drop. Now, here's how we're going to approach this particular segment, this particular episode. First, I want to let the objections speak for themselves. So we're going to watch a few video clips and kind of get an idea for how skeptics like to frame this particular verse or these particular verses, the arguments they use, the verbiage that they use, and really kind of try to understand what they're claiming. We're also going to listen to how they choose to frame it, the context that they choose to put behind it, and why that sometimes sounds so convincing on the surface. And then once we've heard their side of the story, we're going to slow it down and we're going to start actually working through the text. We're going to get into the language, the text, the nuance, and try to see exactly what's being said. And more importantly than that, what's not being said. Because like the last 3 episodes that we've covered, the issue is not really the verse itself, it's how people choose to read the verse in order to keep and form their own opinions. So without any further hesitation, here we go.
We talk a lot on this show about how the Bible condones slavery and how it gives rules for slavery. Exodus explains what to pay for slaves and how hard you can beat them. And a lot of the times when we do this, theists call in to tell us that we're taking things out of context.
Here's another one. And again, going ahead and pause and read. You're allowed to beat them, and if they survive for a day or two before offing, you're not going to be punished because they're your property. If you agree with this, you're disgusting, but you're a true Christian because your Bible says it. This is why indoctrination is dangerous.
Why is it that you can't answer this simple question? Is it a good thing to tell people that they can own people as property, pass that property on to their children, buy slaves from the people around them, and beat them as long as they don't die within a couple days? Is that a good thing?
I don't care. The system in the Bible says that you can buy people as property and own those people as property forever and even pass them down to your kids as inheritance. And you can beat them with a rod so long as they don't pass away within a couple of days. But if they pass away after a couple of days, it's fine because they're your property anyway. Whatever you want to call that, whatever label you want to put on it, or whatever comparison you want to make, that is a system condoned by the Christian God, and it's awful.
All right, so the first thing that should stand out, and I think it's pretty obvious from the clips that we just watched, is how casually the focus gets narrowed down to just 2 specific words or 2 specific phrases, and that is beat them and punished. Everything revolves around those 2 terms. But here's the problem. The meaning of those terms in every single instance of what we just watched is being assumed, not examined. The first creator even leans into this idea that context doesn't really change the meaning of anything. But that claim doesn't hold up. Context is the very thing that determines meaning. Without it, without context, words are literally just empty containers. You can't pull meaning out of a situation or out of a circumstance without first understanding what's happening around it. Think about it like this. If your kid says, "That was sick," they could be saying that something was truly amazing or that something was truly disgusting. The exact same word or the exact same phrase can have 2 distinct meanings, and not just 2 completely different meanings, 2 completely opposite meanings. So without any context, you can make any sentence or any phrase say exactly what you want it to say. And that's exactly what we see happening over and over and again in the clips that we just watched. Now, the second creator goes through his video And he makes a comment at the end of the video, which I feel is very ironic. He makes a comment about how dangerous indoctrination is. Now, the irony in that statement is that he's literally fulfilling the exact textbook definition of indoctrination by producing his video. Oxford Language Dictionary says that indoctrination is the process of teaching a person or a group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And he shows no effort to dig into the meaning of what the passage is actually trying to say. No attempt to understand the language or the structure behind the statement. He just takes a preloaded interpretation that he heard from somebody else that told him it was right and drops it onto the verse as if that settles the entire issue. He's not analyzing anything. He's assuming. Then you've got the third creator who takes a different approach, sometimes even a comical one. He downplays it and makes it more casual. But underneath of that, there's something very strategic going on. He frames the question intentionally in a way that only allows for two answers. Is it bad or is it not bad? And that sounds extremely simple, but it's a classic example of a false dilemma. Because the reality is the passage is actually dealing with legal language, cultural context, and nuance that doesn't fit neatly into little one-word answers. But if you allow that nuance into the conversation, then the whole argument that he's putting forth starts to fall apart. So instead, he steers the conversation, again, intentionally, in the direction that he needs it to go, towards the conclusion that he's already determined is the right answer. And then finally, we have the fourth creator, who honestly might be the most revealing of the bunch. He opens his video by saying, "I don't care," in which he's referring to the explanations and defenses that are typically offered for the verses. And in that instance, I do actually believe him 100%, because what we see quite literally is somebody who doesn't care about learning the truth, or about learning the context behind a passage, or about evaluating it to determine if their viewpoint is correct or false. What we see is somebody who's already decided what the conclusion is going to be and has no interest in revisiting it or evaluating it. There's no curiosity, there's no willingness to test a claim. There's just a commitment to blindly hold on to what somebody else has told him is correct, regardless of if the evidence backs up his claim or not. And when you put all that together, when you look at all four video clips and the common theme that runs through each single one, you start to see a pattern emerge. This isn't really about what the text actually says. It's about framing the text so that it says what they want it to say. Okay, so first we want to look at what the verse actually says. We want to look at the verse in full, read it, and see what we're actually working with. So in order to do that, we're going to shoot right over to Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21. Now, admittedly, most skeptics use the NIV translation when they reference a lot of these verses. And that's because it is probably the translation that gets most of the translations wrong, in my opinion. Does one of the worst jobs in translating some of the text from the original language. So we'll read it from the NIV, but then I'm also going to show you what the ESV says, because the ESV is actually a translation that gets it closer to the original meaning. If we look at verses 20 and 21 in the NIV, it says, "Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property." Now, if we look at the ESV, we can read, "When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money." So out of the gate, you can kind of see the different terminology and the different ways that these verses are being interpreted through the two different translations. One is using the word punished, and the other is using the word avenged. Now, understand why this is such a big issue. Not to self-promote, but we're going to look at an excerpt from our book, which was released last year. And so we'll look at page 148 and read, "A superficial reading might suggest that a master was permitted to beat a servant, provided the beating did not result in death. This interpretation is frequently cited by critics as evidence that the Bible endorses slavery. However, this argument is based on a flawed understanding of the original Hebrew text, as the English translation, particularly in versions such as the NIV, fails to fully capture the precise meaning of the passage. There are three significant translation issues that must be considered to properly understand the intent behind the law. The term punished is a misleading translation. In modern English, punished often conveys the idea of a mild disciplinary action, such as a reprimand or a minor consequence. When we think of punishment, we may envision sending a child to timeout or issuing a fine for a minor infraction. However, the Hebrew word used in this passage is nakam, which carries a far stronger connotation. Nakam is consistently and exclusively used throughout the Bible to refer to killing, capital punishment, or avenging a wrongdoing. If this term sounds familiar, it's because it is the same term used in Numbers 35, where the family avenger was legally permitted to take the life of the person responsible for their relative's death. This indicates that the passage in question is not referring to a light disciplinary action, but rather to a situation in which the servant's death warranted serious legal consequences. The sentence structure was also altered in translation, changing the emphasis of the passage. A small but crucial shift in word placement can significantly impact the meaning of a sentence. Consider the difference between the sentences, "The dog chased the cat across the yard," and "Across the yard, the dog chased the cat." The first emphasizes the action of chasing, while the second places more emphasis on the location of the event. This kind of synecdoche recording occurs in the NIV translation of this passage, leading to a misinterpretation of its true intent. When read in its original structure, the verse places greater focus on the consequences of a master's actions rather than simply allowing the abuse of a servant. So here's the deal. I don't want you to have to take my word for it. We're going to look at the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, or halot, like we try to do in each episode, when we're really looking at the verses and what the words actually mean. Because halot is the consensus scholarship view on what these Hebrew words actually meant and the interpretation of the language at that time. And so the good thing is you don't have to just trust somebody's opinion and swallow dogma because they tell you that it's the right thing or that it really means this or really means that. We can actually go to a plethora of actual biblical scholars and see what they have to say about the word nakam. So halot lists the word nakam as to be avenged or to undergo vengeance. Its stem is the nifl stem, which is a passive and reflective stem. Other definitions include judicial vengeance, legal accountability, and retributive justice. And the bottom line is that this is legal language, and it determines when vengeance is to be applied. So now that we've actually looked at the language, this is where things really start to come into focus. Because the biggest issue with how this passage gets presented from skeptics and by skeptics is the way that the wording somehow gets softened. You hear people say things like, well, if the servant dies, then the master gets punished. Or there's some kind of consequence, but we don't really know what it was. We actually covered a video response to Dan McClellan, who made that exact claim a couple months ago. And at first, that might sound reasonable, but it's not what the text actually says. It's disingenuous because we know that the word nakam in the passage doesn't just mean punished. It means avenged. And that's a really important distinction and an important line to draw because, as we mentioned before, punished is a really broad term. It leaves it open to interpretation. Well, what was that punishment? Well, we don't know. It could have been a slap on the wrist. He could have been sent to timeout. We just don't know. It doesn't tell you what kind of justice would have been carried out. But the word avenged, the word nakam, that's very different. That's not general consequence language. It's legal language, and it's tied to a very specific form of judicial punishment. The kind of punishment and the kind of justice that deals with blood accountability. So when the text says, "He shall be avenged," it's not saying he'll get in trouble. What it's really saying is that a very specific form of legal justice is now being applied to the situation. And that changes how we read the entire passage, or at least how we should read the entire passage, if we're being open and honest. Because now the question isn't, well, is there punishment or is there not punishment? The question is, what kind of justice is being triggered and when? And that's exactly what the passage is doing in this text. It's drawing a line in the sand. If death occurs, or if death happens to the servant or the slave, then that level of justice is enacted. However, if the person survives the beating, then that same level of legal consequence is not automatically applied to the situation. We're talking about Talionic justice. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, bruise for a bruise, life for a life. So this isn't about minimizing harm, and the one thing it's definitely not doing is minimizing or condoning abuse. It's defining very carefully and very clearly when capital level accountability or capital level punishment is enacted and triggered under the law. And once you see that, the way that this verse is usually framed by skeptics falls apart pretty quickly. So in short, the word nakam was a judicial justice term that was used for avenging somebody with blood vengeance. So if we apply that to Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 and 21, what we find is that if a master beat a slave, and that slave passed away as a result of the beating, then the master was to be punished in Talionic justice form, or like for like justice. He was to be executed because he had taken a life. However, if the slave did not die as a result of the beating, then the master was to not be killed because a life had not been lost. Therefore, a life could not be taken. Again, back to Talionic justice, or like for like justice. Biblical scholar Mark Meynell expands on this idea. If found guilty, a master was to be punished, which may result in his death. That was unheard of at a time when the closest legal equivalents only dealt with assault on other people's slaves. If we go back to our book, The Biblical Case Against Slavery, we can read, when analyzed in its original Hebrew form, the law clearly establishes that if a master beats a servant or a slave that results in their death, then justice must be served through vengeance, meaning the master himself was to be put to death. This is not a recommendation, nor an optional recourse. The text does not say that the slave may be avenged or can be avenged. Instead, it states with absolute clarity that the slave must be avenged, reinforcing the strict enforcement of justice. The Hebrew legal structure demanded a reciprocal death penalty in such a scenario. However, if the slave survived the beating, the law did not permit the execution of the master because, according to the broader principle of an eye for an eye, which is introduced in the following few verses, life could only be taken if life had been lost. Furthermore, prior scripture unmistakably affirms that this law of retribution applied universally to all slaves. God had already addressed this matter with clarity and authority, unequivocally declaring that he requires life for life without exception or partiality based on race, ethnicity, or national origin. This divine mandate reflects a foundational truth that justice in God's eyes is impartial and absolute. Moreover, God reinforces this principle by proclaiming that all human beings, regardless of their lineage, status, or cultural identity, are created in his image. This truth transcends national boundaries and affirms the inherent dignity and worth of all mankind, not merely that of Israel. And from each human being, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For the image of God has God made mankind. Genesis 9, 5b and 6. Thus, to summarize, beating a servant or a slave to death was an automatic death sentence for the master. However, even if the servant survived, this did not mean that the master was free of consequence. All right, so if we want to go to one other place in Scripture where we can see this exact same word being used, again, just so you don't have to take my word for it, we can go to Judges chapter 15, verse 7. This is in the middle of a story. It's about Samson and the Philistines, and we can pick it right up in verse 7. So Samson said to them, the Philistines, since you've acted like this, I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you, or nakam. So he attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. So do you notice what's happening here? We have the exact same word, nakam, in the exact same niffle stem. And how do you think we see it being used? Do we see it being used to describe a light punishment or a slap on the wrist, like skeptics try to claim? No. We see it describing vengeance that results in real, tangible consequences. We see violence, retaliation, revenge, and vengeance being carried out. And this isn't soft language. It's not being super vague. It carries weight, it carries seriousness, and it fits perfectly with the tone that was already set, or that we see back in Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21. So when someone comes along and they try to make the claim like, well, nakam just really means punished, and we don't even really know what kind of punishment that was. It could have really been anything. That's not just a misunderstanding of the word. it's an intentional lie. Because at that point, you're not just misunderstanding the word, you're choosing to ignore how it's actually used. And there's a big difference between just misunderstanding something and intentionally choosing to dismiss the evidence right in front of you because it doesn't fit your narrative. Now, I'm not saying that every content creator we watched at the very beginning was being intentionally dishonest. I can tell you that 2 of them were. 2 of them, I know for a fact, know exactly what the word calm means, and they're intentionally choosing to lie to their audience in order to steer the conversation in a direction that they want it to go. But the other 2, it honestly just seems like they're parroting what they've already heard from other people. Problem is they're not stopping to actually examine it or think about it and evaluate it to see if it's actually true or not. Like the one gentleman said in his video, it's indoctrination. They're accepting the conclusion first, and then they're forcing the text to fit into their already preconceived conclusion. And to be honest, that's really the bigger issue here with the entire verse and the entire claim. Because at the end of the day, like we said in previous videos, if your argument or your claim requires you to ignore what the text actually says, and then ignore how the language is used elsewhere in the Bible or elsewhere in the text, and then also requires you to ignore the scholarship evidence, and finally ignore the broader consensus, the broader context and nuance that goes along with it, then it's at least worth stepping back and asking yourself, how relevant is my claim? Or how serious should people actually take my claim? And that's where we're going to start bringing this one to a close. If you made it this far, I really appreciate you taking time to watch the video and actually engage with the topic. My goal with this series isn't just to respond to objections or to respond to skeptics' claims. It's to slow things down, to look at the text honestly, and actually try to understand what it's saying and have a conversation that's grounded in what we actually find in the text. So if you found this video helpful, and if it maybe challenged the way that you've looked at this verse in the past or understood it, then please go ahead and hit the like button. That's the little thumbs up icon underneath the video. It really does help push the content out to more people who are maybe asking these questions or even looking for these answers. And I would personally love to hear from you in the comments, whether you agree, whether you disagree, or whether you just have a comment in general. I would encourage you to write something down below. I do take the time to personally try to respond to each and every one. My only request would be to keep it respectful, keep it honest, and keep it thoughtful, because that's how we actually learn and how we actually make progress. And if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe to our channel. We've got more episodes coming up in the Problematic Bible Verses series. Each one is kind of building on the last, and even after we get through this series, we are going to continue to try to push out content that I really think you would enjoy. So thanks again for being here, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good night.
We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead. It's not like anything you've seen. Yeah, you best believe we are the answers to your dreams.